Welcome. You are listening to Aftersight. This recording is intended solely for individuals who are blind or have low vision.
Welcome to a special edition of Colorado Outdoors Magazine, the 2024 Fishing Guide, read by John Arnold. Fishing for Ghosts. Chasing Arctic Grayling in the Heart of Colorado's Wild. Article by Dustin Dos Cosil. In the shadowy corners of Colorado's angler lore, whispered rumors circulate about a creature with a flamboyant dorsal fin, a piscatorial outlaw known as the Arctic Grayling. Akin to a betta fish on steroids, this elusive species flaunts its vibrant, sail-like fin in the crystal-clear waters it calls home. Tales of its presence, particularly in the enigmatic Pearl Lake near Steamboat, had been brewing in my mind for years, a narrative lurking in the back alleys of my thoughts until it clawed its way to the top of my priority list in the fall of 2023. With a scent of adventure in the air, I reached out to the Colorado Kayak Fishing Club, seeking kindred spirits for this piscine pursuit. Justin Collins, a father, social worker, and emerging master of the kayak angling domain, answered the call with infectious enthusiasm, and the stage was set for our rendezvous with the grayling. Arctic graylings, kin to the salmonid royalty, span continents from North America to distant reaches of North Korea. In the frigid waters of mainland Alaska, they grow to formidable sizes, but here in Colorado, they are relatively pint-sized rebels, with the state record barely scratching the surface of their potential. Pearl Lake, nestled 28 miles north of Steamboat Springs, reveals itself as a hidden gem, a 167-acre jewel adorned with cutthroat, rainbows, brook, and brown trout, and, of course, the elusive grayling. The 75-foot deep body of gold medal water beckons the kayak angler's paddle, promising a fix of tranquility in the midst of nature's splendor. Justin Collins, a relative greenhorn in the realm of kayak fishing, proved to be no novice. With 2 master angler catches and the 2023 Colorado Kayak Fishing Club Anglers of the Year title under his belt, he was the ideal companion for this escapade. As the autumn sun painted the landscape in hues of gold, our journey unfolded. The drive from Silverthorne to Pearl Lake transformed into a canvas of yellows and reds, a spectacle that demanded frequent stops for impromptu snapshots. The pit stop in Steamboat for a slice of Cajun pizza from Bojo's and a fly supply run at Steamboat Fly Fisher added the necessary seasoning to our adventure. Our campsite, perched on a hill overlooking the lake, offered a postcard view of rolling hills draped in the golden tapestry of fall. After brief introductions, we launched into the still waters in search of grayling. The evening unfurled with a few stalker trout in our nets, but it wasn't until Justin felt the ferocious tug on his Tasmanian devil lure that the true spectacle unfolded. A grayling, nearly 15.5 inches of piscatorial prowess, half an inch beyond the coveted Colorado Master Angler threshold. Yet, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows lengthened, the grayling proved to be capricious, eluding our grasp throughout the night. Undeterred, we regrouped at camp, stargazing for the next day's pursuit. Dawn broke with a calm that belied the cold's sharp bite. Back on the water, we traversed the lake's expanse, from the south end to the dam, around to the boat ramp, casting our lines in pursuit of Arctic grayling. Despite Justin's triumphant catch the day prior, the elusive creature remained, well, elusive, ignoring cast after cast, fly after fly. By noon, as the wind stirred the lake's surface into frothy rebellion, we conceded defeat for the moment, retreating from the water's edge. Although the grayling proved elusive in quantity, the sight of one up close and personal marked our journey as a victory, a wild tale spun in the embrace of Colorado's untamed waters, where legends swim beneath the surface, waiting to be unraveled. Dustin Doskosil is a freelance writer and photographer. This is his second time writing for Colorado Outdoors. This article is copyrighted by the author. The long and the short of it. Nymph fishing for trout. Anglers fishing with nymphs in rivers and streams need excellent line control and must constantly adjust leader length and weight. Article by Ron Balak. I watched the red and white plastic sphere bob up and down in the waves, anxiously anticipating its pull beneath the surface. Fast forward decades, and I'm again excitedly watching the plastic sphere and waiting for a worm to entice a trout. However, some things have changed. I now have facial hair, a deeper voice, a smaller bobber, and a fly rod. I also created my worm from orange Chanel, rather than rummaging through the garden at night with a flashlight. Many of us enjoy fishing with floating indicators because they take us back to our childhood. The bobber going under is great fun, whether you're 6 or 60. Today, however, we use floating indicators to detect strikes because most trout in moving water feed predominantly near the bottom, and we can't see their takes. Their food is invertebrates, mostly scuds, worms, crayfish, and the immature stages of aquatic insects known as nymphs. We refer to the pursuit of trout mostly near the bottom of streams and rivers with imitations of these invertebrates as nymph fishing. Unlike dry fly fishing, nymph fishing is possible year-round because aquatic organisms spend the vast majority of their lives at or near the bottom. Several methods of nymph fishing exist, and nymph fishing is not restricted to moving water. In addition to using a traditional fly rod and floating indicator, you can also nymph fish with tenkara rods, or in the European styles of the Czechs, Poles, French, and Spanish, who do not use floating indicators or added weight. We will restrict this article to nymph fishing with traditional fly rods on larger streams and rivers, but will also incorporate some of the tricks used by Europeans. For an in-depth discussion of nymph fishing on small mountain streams, on still waters, with tenkara rods, and in the European styles, please see my book, Fly Fishing Colorado's Backcountry, 2018. I supplemented this article with materials from 3 excellent books published by Stackpole Books: Jason Randall's Nymph Masters, Fly Fishing Secrets from Expert Anglers, 2017, George Daniels' Dynamic Nymphing, Tactics, Techniques, and Flies from Around the World, 2012, and Pat Dorsey's Fly Fishing Tailwaters, Tactics and Patterns for Year-Round Waters, 2015. Indicators are either floaters made of plastic, cork, foam, or yarn that suspend flies and aid in their drift, or slightly made of brightly colored pieces of monofilament built into the leader for the sole purpose of detecting strikes. Some anglers can, remarkably, detect strikes without an indicator and instead look for movement at the point of the entry of their leader in the water, at a knot in the leader, or the tip of their rod. I am not one of these anglers and need an indicator. Floating indicators are the most popular indicators because they are easy to see, adjustable, require little maintenance, and are deadly under the right conditions. They're most effective when fishing in slow to moderate moving water, casting far, executing long drifts, and nymphing from a drift boat. Floating indicators all have design limitations, although some advantages far outweigh these limitations. Brightly colored indicators can scare trout at times, especially in slow-moving, shallow, or unbroken water. Sometimes, however, trout will try to eat your indicator, and you will wish it had a hook. Spooky trout can be pursued using a clear or white indicator, which looks more like a non-threatening bubble or foam, or with a more visible black indicator, which looks like flotsam. Strike indicators can create a hinge in the leader, which interferes with presentation and detecting strikes. The most commonly used strike indicator, the thingamabobber, accentuates this hinge and kinks one's leader. Adhesive pinch-on foam indicators are not adjustable and cannot support heavy flies. Yarn indicators made from polypropylene are the most sensitive for strike detection, but they can be difficult to cast in windy conditions and need periodic treatment with a floatant. Floating indicators can face bigger limitations due to varying speeds of currents in streams and rivers. Due to friction, currents slow along the bank and the bottom. They are fastest toward the middle of the river and at or just below the surface. Below the surface, a current speed decreases with depth, being slowest at the bottom. This is where trout hang out, expending the least amount of energy to fight the current and waiting for the bottom-dwelling invertebrates to float by. When we use floating indicators, however, it's moving faster than the flies on the bottom, and it can unnaturally drag the flies instead of tumbling them along or pulling them upward off the bottom. We may miss subtle takes because we don't have a taut linear connection between our indicator and flies due to a bow in the leader caused by varying speeds of the current with depth. Our flies also drift behind the indicator rather than under it. The faster the water, the farther behind the flies will drift. Fortunately, anglers can compensate for the limitations of floating indicators, and the first step is to use the correct tackle. Most Colorado anglers prefer a 9-foot, 5-weight fly rod, and this is a good nymphing rod, but a 9.5 or 10-foot rod will give an angler better reach. Of course, one will use a floating line matched to the weight of the rod, but anglers should be especially diligent on cleaning this line and adding floatant to the tip so that it doesn't sink and put added drag on the indicator. Anglers have many opinions on the correct type and construction of leaders when using floating indicators. Randall, Daniel, and Dorsey all suggested starting with a 9 or 7.5 foot knotless, 3X or 4X tapered leader and adding length of 5X or 6X fluorocarbon tippet with a blood knot, surgeon's knot, or tippet ring. They differ in the arrangement of the terminal tackle attached to the tapered lead. I prefer starting with a 9-foot 4X tapered lead and cutting off some of the butt because I find it too stiff and difficult to uncoil. I then use a surgeon's knot to attach 12 to 14 inches of 5X fluorocarbon tippet, to which I'll then tie on a heavy nymph. I then attach another section of fluorocarbon leader to the eye or hook bend of this nymph with a clinch knot and tie on a lighter nymph. I add split shot just above the surgeon's knot and finally add the thingamabobber or yarn indicator above the split shot at a distance equal to 1 1/2 times the depth of the water. My total leader is long enough to reach deeper depths, but short enough to cast without becoming a tangled mess. This is often about 10 feet in total length. Presentation is more important than fly patterns, except during a hatch. Imitating the larval and pupal stages of local midges and caddis, mayfly nymphs, scuds, and worms is always a good strategy. However, anglers must constantly adjust the weight of their split shots so the flies stay on the bottom and tumble along naturally. When presenting nymphs properly, the indicator should float downstream slower than the surface current to match the slower current on the bottom. Too much weight results in a noticeable drag on the indicator sinking and or frequent snags on the bottom. If not occasionally tagging the bottom, however, you need more weight. I think anglers err more often by not using enough weight. Occasionally I'll step into a run that an angler has just vacated after unsuccessfully fishing it. I add more weight than I think is necessary and often catch a fish or two. You may also need to adjust the length of the leader between the indicator and weight. Too long a leader can result in snagging the bottom or dragging flies along unnaturally. Too short a leader will lift the flies off the bottom. Other adjustments are also needed to attain a good presentation. One way to get flies down to the bottom quicker and thereby get a longer effective drift is to modify someone's upstream cast. This is done with a tuck cast, whereby one stops the forward cast abruptly and slightly lifts up the rod tip, causing the flies and weight to land in the water first and downstream of the indicator. If everything lands in a zone where the surface current is of one speed, a proper presentation is more likely. However, This seldom happens with long casts, since drag results due to surface currents of varying speed. Drag is lessened by throwing an upstream mend in the line. If the drift is long, several mends may be needed. One can also mend in the air while casting with a reach cast. One abruptly stops at the end of the forward cast, then reaches one's arm 90 degrees upstream. One keeps a little extra line in one's hand so that the rig is not pulled back at oneself. In addition to mending, one should point the rod tip at the floating indicator and follow it downstream, keeping the rod tip at a constant height above the indicator. In a perfect short drift, both the line and the leader are held off the water. The only point of contact with the water's surface is the indicator. Fishing short drifts with line and leader off the water is referred to as high sticking. Although in true high sticking, one holds the rod higher and uses a slighter rather than a floating indicator to minimize drag. One actively leads the flies and weight downstream. This method takes much more skill than using a floating indicator and is more demanding, as one must extend one's arm out over the water and constantly watch the slider while ensuring that the flies are drifting properly on the bottom. When lifting up a rig at the end of a drift, the flies would be upstream from the slider to ensure a good drift. However, if the flies are downstream from the slider, one needs to add more weight or slow the speed at which one is leading the flies. High sticking, which is a modification of the Czech and my ancestors' Polish styles of Euro nymphing, works best with short drifts close to trout holding in broken water, and when the depth of the river doesn't vary markedly. If one does much high sticking, it pays to invest in a longer, lightweight rod with a softer tip to fish with longer leaders. When achieving the near-perfect drift with nymphs, it is important to recognize strikes. Pat Dorsey told me years ago, quote, "If your indicator moves, set the hook. If your indicator stops, set the hook. If you think about a fish, set the hook," end quote. While this latter sentence may be an exaggeration, I think he meant that you do not always see the strike, but instead may sense or feel it. Jason Randall has donned scuba gear and watched trout take flies beneath a floating indicator and observed that many times it does not move. He even showed me a video of this. Trout don't take a fly like we bite into an apple. Instead, they suck it up by expelling water through their gills. They can ingest and spit out a fly faster than you can say fish on. Such as, one should set the hook instantaneously and firmly, but not so hard as to break the fine tippet. The set should be into the fish, generally downstream. When completing your drift, do not immediately pick up if there is additional fishable water downstream. Instead, feed line into your drift, thereby extending its length. When you're ready to recast, let your rig swing slowly back toward the surface. This mimics an emerging insect rising toward the surface and is known as the Leeson ring lift. If you see insects starting to hatch, try nymphing higher in the water column, as trout will certainly move up and take such vulnerable prey. If you repeatedly get no strikes on near-perfect drifts, try wiggling your rod tip or moving it up and down. This imparts a little life action into your flies. If consistently missing strikes, try shortening up the tippet between the split shot and the flies. As the hatch progresses, remove your flies and indicator and switch to a dry fly with a nymph on a dropper. The dry fly makes a good indicator and doubles the chance of hooking a fish due to working both the surface and the subsurface. With all the requirements of reading currents, lengthening and shortening leaders, adjusting weight, and repeated mending, there are ample opportunities for screwing up and having a fishless day. This can be frustrating, and Jason Randall says that you may question whether it's all worth it and if you should take up golf instead. Don't. I played golf for about 20 years and can attest that it is a much more difficult sport. On the other hand, there will be times when all this fiddling won't make any difference. The fish will strike with reckless abandon. I remember fishing a gravel bar in Alaska downstream from spawning sockeyes. where rainbows and dollies were gorging on the salmon eggs. My rig, consisting of an orange bead heavy split shot and with a yarn indicator, barely hit the water before fish struck, leaving me no time to mend. George, my guide, was helping another angler upstream, but he came back to check on me. He immediately castigated me for my ugly drifts. After telling him I caught 13 trout in that run, he just turned away and shook his head. It was better than parring every hole at Pebble Beach. Ron Bullock is a frequent contributor to Colorado Outdoors and is the author of the award-winning books Fly Fishing Colorado's Backcountry and The Fly Fishing Guide to 800 High Country Lakes in Colorado. Both are available through his website, ronbelak.com. This article is copyrighted by the author. Finding Joy by Dan England. Denise Joy will see a young fish swimming through an alpine lake she's hiked for hours to reach and feels proud of it. You made it, she will think and smile to herself. Good job. It's not a parent's pride she feels. That's for the workers at the Colorado Parks and Wildlife fish hatcheries. Nonetheless, she's had a brief but important role in the little one's life. She's likely the one who got it there. Joy flies for CPW as one of the organization's full-time pilots. She helps give biologists a bird's-eye view of their research, such as tracking and surveying big game herds, but she spends a good bit of time in the air stalking alpine mountain lakes. This is not a job for everyone. It's not even a job for most pilots. Many of the lakes are tucked into mountain cirques, leaving Joy little room for error. Even when working as a pilot already doesn't have much tolerance for mistakes. She has to fly into a small area, guarded by the peaks, maneuver just above the lake, drop the fish, and quickly climb out of the high alpine cirque, all while keenly monitoring the winds those giants inspire. If that sounds stressful, well, you're right. One pilot died in a downdraft 15 years ago. Denise had to fly 2 years dropping fish with fellow CPW pilots before flying them solo. This is the training for every newly hired pilot. But she wanted to learn more on her own, too. So, besides studying the maps, she hiked to the lakes. Quote, there were a few really challenging lakes in the San Juans and Holy Cross, so I hiked them to get a better visual for it, Joy said. You can see how the winds are working, what they're actually doing in this cirque versus the other, how each area has its own microclimates, end quote. That led to a talk with Larry Gepfert, a longtime pilot for CPW, about how much fun it would be to fish all the lakes they've stocked. Yes, Gepfert told her, you should do that. The unofficial bet was sealed that day. Joy sometimes wishes she'd looked at how many lakes the CPW stocks before she made it. CPW stocked 245 in 2021 and more than 300 in 2022. CPW stocks a lake every other year by regions divided by north and south. Joy has probably stocked more than 300 herself. So for now, that's her goal, to hike and to fish every lake she brings to life. She's closer than you may think. Joy is the first female pilot CPW ever hired. She started her career in Alaska, and she was proud to be a pilot because of what she endured to get there. A long, arduous path from her first flight at the age of 18. She didn't have the same resources as others, including financial stability from home, or aviators in the family to help mentor her. Quick internet searches for scholarships and finding new communities were not options yet. She had numerous jobs, including restaurants, scraping enough money together for flight school, and then something would happen. One time, the owner of a school had an accident with his aircraft and flew into a building. The school closed. She'd hoped to be treated like an equal, but things were a bit different 20 years ago. For all the folks that helped her on her path, there were many who challenged her abilities. She faced and triumphed over many unfair biases and rude comments to realize her dream. She stayed with it because even at 8, she had a burning desire to fly. Anyone with a stressful job, or most jobs really, need to find ways to decompress at the end of the day. Quote, flying can be especially hard on the nervous system, end quote, says Joy. Pilots train themselves for smooth reactions and to think clearly and calmly in challenging situations. Look at the way Sully Sullenberg landed his plane on the Hudson River when he lost both engines, saving the lives of 155. One of the reasons she loves her job is not only the beautiful areas it takes her to. Not many others got to see the mountain cirques where she dumped the fish, but just a handful of others got the perspective she did from the front seat of a plane. When Joy moved from place to place with her mother and brothers, the outdoors were always there. Quote, "Nature was my playground. It was my solace," end quote, she said. She talks about that journey in a short documentary, Fight or Flight, that made the rounds of the outdoor film festivals and was publicly released this year. She has since learned to respect nature and that certain parts of it aren't always there for you. When hiking, and especially when flying above the tree line, it can be a blustery place where a fast storm can strike you down. Quote, "The mountains have their own spirit," she said. "Sometimes they want you to come visit, and sometimes they don't," end quote. The trips to the lakes vary from 4-mile treks to 17-mile journeys. A few are ensconced in the Needle Mountains, and it took her 42 miles of backpacking to reach them. Some require scrambling, but not many, and some aren't mapped. More than a few don't have a guidebook leading her to them. She'd probably use a map and compass anyway. She doesn't keep a list. "I should," she said, but she knows what she's done, and it's more than 100. Yes, 100. Since she began 5 years ago. She generally goes in the summer, like most alpine hikers, because the snow melts, clearing the trails. In 2022, she did 18. She did 20 in 2023. Quote, "I keep getting more and more serious about it," end quote, she said. She picks the lake she goes to at random, though it's not like it's a dartboard. Quote, "I have a list of lakes that I want to do that year, but then I'll fly over and change my mind on the list," Joy said. "Sometimes lakes get priority because it's just so beautiful, and I just have to go," end quote. Fishing is much more intentional for her. She didn't like fishing when she first tried it, but she learned to use fishing, as much as hiking, to heal herself. Quote, "You have to be still, and stillness is hard," she said, "but it's taught me so much, to be in the moment. It's also such a cool thing. How many people can say they stock the fish and also fish them?" End quote. It's been harder for her, she admits, as the Front Range continues to widen and draw even more people to it. She used to see maybe 1 or 2 fishing with her. They're not 14ers after all, or famous hikes, or easy to reach, but she's seeing more and more people who don't respect the land as much, leaving trash and waste. The wilderness, even her backyard, was a wide open private space for her. She can't help but feel a little protective of it. Quote, "There's magic in that space and that alpine," end quote, she said. Dan England is a freelance author and editor and a frequent contributor to Colorado Outdoors. This article is copyrighted by the author. Thank you for joining us for this special edition of Colorado Outdoors, the 2024 Fishing Guide, read by John Arnold.
If you enjoyed this program, please register for our free services at www.aftersight.org or by calling 303-786-7777.